Hi, my name's Andy Baker, and today I'll present the findings of research looking at fire exclusion on the far north coast of New South Wales, using Byron Shire as a case study. Firstly, I'll outline the process of fire exclusion and vegetation change, outline the GIS analysis methods, and finally the results of the study. Firstly, three key messages. Nearly half of Byron Shire's biodiversity needs regular fire to maintain suitable habitat. Without regular fire, habitats can change rapidly. And if habitat becomes unsuitable, localised extinctions follow. Vegetation change following long-term fire exclusion is a worldwide phenomenon and is well documented across all continents except Antarctica. Vegetation change is frequently divided into two main processes, including the transition of treeless ecosystems to forests, which is well documented for the savannas of northern Australia and the heathlands of western and southern Australia, and secondly the transition of open forest to rainforest, which is well documented in high rainfall areas such as Tasmania, the Sydney region and the Queensland wet tropics. A 2014 study which mapped around 2 million hectares of vegetation in the wet tropics region found that 25% of open forest and woodland has irreversibly transitioned to rainforest since the 1950s. Of the region's major open forest types, 3 have had more than 70% of their range captured by rainforest since the 1950s, and several types are now considered endangered due to extensive rainforest transition. So why is this change happening? This diagram represents the development of vegetation through time. On the New South Wales far north coast, high rainfall and mild temperatures allow vegetation to reach full development to rainforest, the region's climatic potential. Vegetation is always moving towards this climatic potential of rainforest, unless interrupted by disturbance. However, in this region and throughout the world, fire deflects this development, and regular fire maintains the vegetation in a narrow state of development along the spectrum. Most importantly, it is fire interval that determines where along the spectrum vegetation is maintained. With a very short fire interval, say every 5 years, development may be arrested at the grassland stage. If fire interval is increased to around 20 years, dry sclerophyll forest may develop. And if fire is excluded for 100 years or more, rainforest is likely. Those vegetation types that are maintained by a specific fire interval are termed fire dependent. They are considered fire dependent not only because fire exclusion results in a shift to another vegetation type, but because virtually all species require fire for recruitment and will only recruit after wholesale removal of biomass and baring of the ground surface by fire. Now let's look at the process of forest encroachment into treeless ecosystems. This is an endangered heathland restricted to Byron Bay. In between fires, young trees can recruit into the heathland. Historically, at about this time, a fire would pass through the community, removing all the young trees and restoring the original heathland structure. However, in the continued absence of fire, trees continue to develop, and if a fire passed through at this point, many of the trees would survive. This represents the passing of a critical threshold, making restoration of formless structure with fire alone impossible. The trees continue to develop an overstory above the heathland, and shade-intolerant understory plants begin to drop out of the community, as can be seen in the bare areas in the right of the photograph. Continued canopy development continues to suppress understory vegetation, causing a dramatic reduction in species diversity and a reduced ability of the community to carry fire. To show an example of this process from the air, this is an area of wet heathland in Brunswick Heads Nature Reserve. The fine textured area within the orange line is treeless vegetation, and beyond the line, forest and tall shrubland. Moving forward 30 years without fire to 2012, forest and tall shrubland has displaced much of the heathland. Similar trends are found in most of Byron Shire's treeless ecosystems. Now let's look at the transition from open forest to rainforest. This diagram represents a typical open forest structure. In particular, note the diverse understory dominated by flammable shrubs and grasses. In between fires, rainforest trees recruit into the understory. This process can be rapid and widespread due to seed dispersal by birds and bats. Historically, at this stage, a fire would pass through the community, removing the rainforest trees and restoring the typical open forest structure. Without fire, however, rainforest trees continue to recruit and grow. Studies show that most rainforest tree species quickly reach an age where they can survive complete top kill from intense wildfires. This is known as the fire resistance threshold. At this stage, rainforest trees are no longer removed by fire alone, but need manual removal to restore the original structure. And rapid rainforest regrowth resumes the transition process quickly after fire. With ongoing fire exclusion, the developing rainforest mid-story begins to shade out the flammable understory. This is known as the fire suppression threshold. At this stage, the understory is unlikely to carry fire, and the option for applying an ecological burn in safe weather conditions has been lost, and floristic diversity is also lost from the understory. So is fire exclusion a problem in Byron Shire? To determine this, GIS analysis was undertaken that compared time since last fire with fire interval guidelines for mapped vegetation across the study area. These data sets were then combined to determine fire exclusion status across a range of key conservation values. Preparing fire records for analysis was a one-step process that involved combining all fire records from the National Parks and Wildlife Service and Rural Fire Service to produce a single layer showing all recorded fire events over the last 40 years. Mapping recommended fire intervals involved assigning fire interval recommendations to map vegetation across the study area. Step 1 involved combining vegetation datasets from the National Parks and Wildlife Service, Byron Shire Council and the Northern Rivers Catchment Management Authority into a single layer. Step 2 involved identifying all areas of exotic vegetation such as camphor laurel and removing these from further analysis, leaving only native vegetation. For step 3, vegetation polygons were then assigned to one of 6 vegetation formations. Step 4 involved determining the fire relationships by reference to the literature. Fire-dependent vegetation included all grasslands, sedgelands, heathland and sclerophyll forest types. Fire-sensitive vegetation included rainforest, mangroves and salt marsh. Undetermined mostly included areas of mixed regrowth where there was insufficient data to determine the original vegetation type or fire relationship. The final step involved assigning fire intervals to each vegetation formation by reference to fire frequency guidelines. The 2006 guidelines of Penny Watson were used as they are regionally specific, recommended by the Northern Rivers Regional Biodiversity Management Plan, and they consider the risk of vegetation change resulting from fire exclusion. In the left column are the different vegetation formations, while in the right-hand column are the recommended fire intervals given in years. While the first formations have only simple ranges, wet sclerophyll forest is divided by understory composition. The recommendations for wet sclerophyll forest also have a 2-tiered fire interval, including more frequent low-intensity understory fires and infrequent high-intensity canopy fires. The vegetation was coded with the maximum interval for the top 4 formations, and for wet sclerophyll forest, the maximum understory interval was used. Finally, the understory was not known for many areas of wet sclerophyll forest. These areas were automatically classed as of concern if they have no fire for more than 20 years, given that at least some areas with shrubby understory were known to occur within this group. And this map shows the resulting distribution of recommended fire intervals across the study area. So is fire exclusion a problem in Byron Shire? Looking at all fire-dependent vegetation across the study area, only 10% is within threshold. 61% is fire excluded, with the remainder classed as of concern. Again, the of concern class is known to contain areas beyond threshold, but exact extent cannot be determined. Looking at the individual vegetation formations, all grassland is beyond threshold, and all remaining formations are less than 20% within threshold. So looking now at fire-dependent endangered ecological communities, only 15% are within threshold. Importantly, these are our highest conservation value vegetation communities and provide unique habitat to myriad threatened species. And looking at the individual endangered ecological communities, a similar trend is evident. A similar extent of coastal wetlands is fire excluded. These wetlands range from open sedge lands to forested wetlands and again are important centres for threatened biodiversity. Again, with coastal koala habitat, only 16% is within threshold. Koala feed trees, mostly eucalypt species, all require fire to recruit, and as time since fire grows longer, opportunities for the recruitment of overstory feed trees are rapidly disappearing on many sites. What about high frequency fire? High frequency fire is listed as a key threatening process and is routinely listed as a threat in ecological assessments. Conversely, low frequency fire is not listed as a KTP and almost never mentioned in ecological assessments. So what is their relative importance in Byron Shire? As can be seen, high frequency fire is almost mythical in Byron Shire, comprising less than 1% of all areas affected by inappropriate fire frequency since 1974. Fire exclusion is spatially extensive, but by how long are thresholds exceeded? This graph shows the proportion of grassland as a function of time since the last fire. The maximum interval for grasslands is 10 years. The grey area is where most of the communities should operate within threshold, and it is immediately beyond this point that species and habitat are predicted to decline. Yet the vast majority of grasslands are more than 4 times past threshold, and the time since last fire for these areas is in fact unknown, further increasing the likelihood of localised species extinction and habitat change. As we can see, large proportions of many formations are more than 2 or more times beyond threshold. Looking at the impacts on floristic diversity, a total of 942 flora species have been recorded for Byron Shire, of which 430 or 46% are restricted to fire-dependent communities. So how is this diversity distributed across different vegetation strata? This graph shows the proportion of all fire-dependent species occurring within each height class across all fire-dependent vegetation types. As can be seen, 84% of species occur below 2 metres, and it is this lower strata which is the first to be impacted by vegetation change and shading. So while a eucalypt forest may seem in good condition, even early rainforest development in the understory may have already suppressed the vast majority of floristic diversity. So finally, what about the broader region? An OEH analysis using the thresholds of Liz Kenny and Ross Bradstock reveal a similar pattern for both fire exclusion generally and the relative importance of high frequency fire across the region. So in conclusion, the study demonstrates the operation of a major threatening process affecting Byron Shire's biodiversity that has previously been little recognised. The threat is potentially widespread in similar regions along the coast. Restoration of transition sites may be complicated by encroaching trees that have become fire resistant and loss of flammable understory to carry ecological burns in safe weather. Further research is needed to determine what is the extent of fire exclusion in other regions and how quickly are critical thresholds reached in different ecosystems.